Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Alex. Today we are going to catch up on Season 1, Episode 7 of V-Wars. This episode is called The Night is Darkening Round Me. The title of it seemed a little bit on the nose, so I went ahead and Googled it because I suspect that with such a long title and with it seeming to be so on the nose that it might have something in common with some of our previous titles in that it may have been from a poem. And indeed, that also seems to be the case with this episode, much as Season 3's Because I Could Not Stop for Death was an Emily Dickinson reference. So for The Night is Darkening Round Me, this is a reference to an Emily Bronte poem. And it goes like this. The night is darkening round me, the wild winds coldly blow, but a tyrant spell has bound me, and I cannot go. The giant trees are bending, their bare boughs weighed with snow. The storm is fast ascending, and yet I cannot go. Clouds beyond clouds above me, wastes beyond wastes below, but nothing drear can move me. I will not, cannot go. So really, I am reading that to you at the beginning of this episode rather than at the end, as I did before with the Emily Dickinson poem, because I want you to really keep that in mind as we are talking about this episode of V-Wars. Really, this is largely about Luther from my perspective. In this episode, he is experiencing a lot of darkness. He's fighting a lot of battles, and he's deeply worried about Des. Not only has he lost Des at a certain point, but he's also afraid that Des is going to turn into a blood like Michael. He is also recently very much traumatized from all of these people dying in front of him, and then him killing someone, and also being embroiled in all of these interactions with vampires and humans. He's seen a lot of death on all sides of this, and it's a lot for Luther. But no matter what, he is dedicated to his kid and also to trying to save these other people, like his friend Mike, who he believes are just sick. And in that way, he cannot go. He is stuck in this place, even as this dystopia is setting in around him. He knows that everything is going to get bad really quickly now, but he still cannot leave. He has to stay right in the thick of it to do the important work that he has to do, whether that be protecting his son or trying to protect his brother and getting his brother and others like them the help that they need, making sure that this information about the NH47 gene doesn't fall into the hands of the government, who have shown Luther so far that they truly cannot be trusted, and that in this universe they are not above killing their own to supplant those individuals with people who are more militant. So it also says here, clouds beyond clouds above me, waste beyond waste below, but nothing drear can move me. I will not, cannot go. So it's not even just that Luther can't anymore. He is starting to really put his foot down himself, and it's not even just that he cannot go. It's that he won't go. He's not going to back down on this. He is going to see this all through. And Luther he's been on a roller coaster ride, you guys, for this entire show so far. He has had to kill his new wife. He has had, in front of his son, he has had to face his ex-wife defaming him on the internet, and then being reunited with her in a public way, and having his detail pull a gun on her, and then later his detail has eaten his assistant, or attempted to attack his assistant Teresa. It's been a wild ride for Luther, and he still has a lot to go, and that's not even touching on any of his interactions he has had with his brother up to this point. There's also, covering up a murder and everything else. Now he's hiding information from the government. He's made sure that Teresa and Des are safely out of the facility before he's done so they cannot use them against him. But he is still just really buckled in tight for this ride, and he wants to leave, but he cannot until he can make sure that these people are protected and everyone's going to be okay. So, keep that in mind as we discuss this episode. Luther's already experienced a lot of darkness, but things are, believe it or not, about to get even more grim in the world of V-Wars. So, up to this point, Luther has been really worried that Des would turn, and that they would perhaps kill him, or maybe even worse, experiment on him. So he has kept that private and secret, and has had Teresa work with him to smuggle Des out of there under the pretense of getting a dental appointment. So he has sent them to his bro's house, not his actual brother, Michael, but his friend, who is another doctor. So he sent them over to his practice, rather, and now he is trying to get out himself. There is a lot of carnage in this episode, which is, par for the course for this show, and this episode maintains that trend. It is around here that Mila becomes one of my favorite characters. She is in the process of saving a random woman from another vampire attack, much as she has before. And this is something that is probably very complicated for Mila. So she is a Vertilac, and we know from our previous discussions about Vertilacs, and also the epigenetic component of this story, that Vertilacs tend to run in families, and they are compelled to turn everyone in their family. Which might also explain, if they're adhering very closely to that, why Danny had gone so long without following through on what Mila was asking her to meet up to discuss their mother's health and wellness, only for Danny to finally show up and then almost immediately feed upon Mila, thinking that Mila was dead. That's just what Vertilacs do, and we know that they have that Vertilac gene. However, even though Mila could very well feed upon people using her venom without killing them, she could get them addicted to her, or even just one and done juice box punch it without killing them. She is so disgusted by this concept of hurting other people that it has really driven her to the point of killing other vampires. This is absolutely unacceptable to her, And what her sister Dani has done to her is also absolutely unacceptable. So Mila was a very kind soul before, just like Dani was very selfish and power hungry. So that is being expressed now in vampire form too. Mila did not seemingly feed on anyone once she turned. She's been drinking out of bags from the blood bank. So in that way, because she has such a strong willpower and this strong moral compass, that is very likely fueling her rage at Dani as well. It's that concept of, well, if I can do this, why can't you? And perhaps to some extent that may be true, but we know that with Michael, at least, when he was initially starting to feed, he didn't quite understand that he was even feeding. It's like the bloodlust and the thirst really took him over. And he couldn't remember at first. I don't think that Michael really did believe that he had killed that woman initially, the one that Luther helps him to hide her body. I think that Michael legitimately could not really parse together what had happened, and his mind was blown. I don't think he was lying to Luther. He believed that he didn't kill this woman, and then it was just coming back to him in flashes later on, until it got to the point where he didn't care to try to leash it in. Although we see in his interaction with the lady at the bus stop who was blind that he is able to. Danica exercises no such restraint. She very willfully, early on, turns people into essentially her blood slaves. So they are really addicted to her venom. And we talked about this in a previous episode about how it's like the concept of strawberries, where you're getting someone addicted to a drug so that you can use their body. And often that is used in reference to women who are addicted to crack cocaine, so that then the dealers can trade sex for these drugs with them. So in this instance, it is Danica getting them addicted to her venom and then continuing to feed off of their bodies. It's a little bit different, but they're both renewable sources, essentially. So blood and also sex, but it is still a really messed up thing for her to do. So she's been busted with that nest, and that's great, but Mila has not embraced this at all. She has outright abhorred it, and she is not down for it. So I don't know how that's going for her, where she is trying to fight her natural bloodthirst, but she very clearly has a really great willpower. Mila might be a fantastic Green Lantern. That would be kind of baller to watch, like a vampire Green Lantern. I'd be here for it. But you get where I'm coming from. So Mila is fighting this on her own and is just decimating these vampires. Now, I don't know much about Mila from before she became a vampire, but she seems to have picked up this extending baton pretty quickly with her fight moves. Now, I know that Michael was already very strong before, but I don't think that it necessarily improved his ability to fight beyond what he already knew. So by that I mean technique. I don't think it really is imparting a new fighting technique to them. Perhaps some instincts, but that wouldn't necessarily explain how Mila is so good at whacking them with these, collapsible batons. I digress. I just have some questions about it. It's kind of like when Rey is on the planet with Luke and she's pretty much there for like 3 days practicing and she suddenly gets super baller with a lightsaber. It would have made a lot more sense if it had been a staff saber rather than it being like the sword component or like a saber. Because Rey grew up using a staff, we see her using a staff in The Force Awakens initially while she's on Jakku. So I could believe that she would know how to use that specific weapon a lot easier than just suddenly learning how to use the lightsaber. Very similarly, I don't think we have quite enough of a backstory for Mila in this to explain how she's able to do this. But also, I guess they're not trying to give us too much of a heads up about which way she's going to go in that aspect. So, we'll see. I need to really buckle down and read the graphic novels so I can perhaps pick up some more context that may have been lost between the comic pages and the TV adaptation. We are going to go on a quick break, but when we come back, we are going to pick up with Luther and where he is in trying to find Des and Teresa. Stay tuned.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's GSMCpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Before the break, we were talking about the wars being based in episode 7 on the poem The Night is Darkening Round Me by Emily Bronte. So we discussed the words of the poem and its basic theme, where someone feels that they're prevented from going somewhere up until they are deciding to stand their ground. They will not be dissuaded from staying there any more than they could have been capable of leaving to begin with. Cannot has turned into will not, and it is about willpower. So in that way, perhaps it is also about Mila in that regard. So Mila is really experiencing a darkening of her world. Everything that she has known and loved has recently changed. Absolutely, from her perspective, for the worst. She has just been out missing, essentially. She's decided she's not going back to her apartment where she had been with Danica when Danica fed from her, and Danica thought she had killed her, but she had not. So she's technically still missing, according to what the police and Danny think. And she has this spell that's binding her where she is. We don't have these vampires having trouble walking out in the sunlight or anything like that. It's a genetic change that does not seem to be accompanied with porphyria or xeroderma pigmentosum or anything like that. Nothing that would really seem to make them more sensitive to sunlight. I suppose that they could try to put that in there epigenetically, but it's a lot easier to tell the show storyline without having that in there. So, I'm totally fine with that artistic choice in this. Firstly, it's a vampire show, and secondly, it's art. It's not meant to be entirely factual. It's speculative fiction, and it's drawing upon different works of literature and fiction and folklore and mythology, and also science now. And I really love that about science fiction. I am super excited for that, you guys. How they are using this to further our folklore. And that's just science fiction in general, but it's one of the things that makes me super passionate about it. So I really enjoy this concept of naming some of the episodes after poems, and also looking at Mila from this new perspective. She knows that she is about to be in the middle of a hot mess. Could she totally just grab some blood bags and bail and go somewhere else across the country? She totally could. But for whatever reason, all of these individuals continue to stay in Seneca. Danny is in Seneca. Mila remains in Seneca, even though she is hiding out somewhere else and is not in her home. Luther is still in Seneca. It's like they cannot get out of there for all of these different reasons, even with this storm bearing down on them. And the storm is both biological and sociocultural. It is also political. There is a violent nature to it as well, both on the side of the Bloods and Vertilacs, as well as people like the motorcycle gang members, and also folks like the government, Kalex, Nikos, all of them. So there are multiple sides to this, and all of them seem to be pretty scary and pretty violent, but yet none of them can depart for different reasons. So I really like that concept, and how at first Mila was very disturbed by what had happened to her. She seemed very sad and scared and just upset in general that she couldn't eat the wings or whatever it was she had ordered in that bar while she looked really sick. And she saw her sister calling her after she had found out that her body was not at the house and that there weren't any signs of a struggle from the investigating officer. So Danny knows that she's alive somewhere, or at least that she survived the initial attack. But she doesn't want Danny to know where she is. And over time, we are seeing that sadness and grief and betrayal turn into absolute rage. For Mila, this isn't just like an ultimate betrayal issue. It seems to be kind of the straw that broke the camel's back for her. Danny has always been selfish and crappy, and this is just a whole new level of it. She's not able to continue just loving her sister anymore. She can't just hold that resentment inside of her. Danny's always been selfish, and now Mila is just so thoroughly and completely passed over it. Danny decided that her temporary pleasure was more important than Mila's life. Danny will very literally stop at nothing to ensure that she gets what she wants, and everyone else can just be screwed over by her. She doesn't care at all. Does she put that much effort into finding Mila? No. She gives her a couple calls, and that appears to be it, at least as far as we can see. And the rest of the time, she is off cavorting with Michael, or is feeding on a whole bunch of people and just causing general mayhem. Danny is almost like if a Batman villain was a vampire. What that would look like on the TV show Gotham. That is the feeling that I get from how Danny is. She's not even necessarily truly evil. She's just mostly chaotic neutral. Danny cares about what is good for Danny, and she's not concerned about anything that doesn't negatively, strongly impact her. She really could not care less. And you can see that in her affect too. She largely just looks unbothered. She's either unbothered or she is somewhat annoyed with the other people who are in the blood group. But for the most part, Danny's just absolutely hedonistic and unapologetic about it, completely unashamed. In that regard, I can totally understand why Mila would be so upset by that. During this episode, though, we also get to catch up a little bit with Luther. So, a large portion of this episode involves Luther trying to find Des and Teresa. He wants to be able to escape, and remember, Niklos had agreed to help him escape when the time came, and Luther's well aware that Niklos can't be trusted. Claire O'Hagan had told him that before she was killed by Niklos. And Luther trusted Claire, at least far more so than anyone else, because Claire seemed to have a more open mind about things like bringing Michael in without harming him or downright killing him. So Luther knows he can't trust this guy, but he has no other option. And just because he knows he can't trust Niklos doesn't mean that Niklos needs to know that Luther knows that he can't trust Niklos. It's getting super crazy at this point, just very involved in this episode, and I like it. It's very tangled. So Luther has made this deal with Niklos, and Niklos decides to let him go, and then send someone after him to either kill him or just track down the other assets. Or both. Either or all the above. So Luther is driving around trying to find Des, and it is a whole new hellscape out there for him already. The world is indeed darkening around him, and the storm is coming. Luther is trying to just drive down the street, and it looks like zombie apocalyptic scenarios that we often see portrayed, except in this case, they are vampires, and one of them leaps onto the hood of his car, and just as he feels that he's about to get killed, he is saved by some dudes with some firearms. So, essentially, some rednecks come through and save him, and after he holds his hands up to them and looks really scared and freaked out, they decide he's probably not a blood, and he's not, at least not worth them using their ammo right now to kill him, and they just move along. But it's a very different world than the last time Luther had been out of the facility to go and meet with Rachel. So the world around him is very swiftly declining into some type of dystopia and anarchy and violence in general. And he says that with the poem, or rather the authors say that with the name of the title, The Night is Darkening Round Me, by Emily Bronte. And it outright points out, the storm is fast descending, and yet I cannot go. If Luther were able to just drive out of town, that would be a lot easier. But he has his priorities. And his number one priority has always been Des. Even if Des turns into a vampire, that doesn't matter for Luther. He views that as an illness, and he believes that he will be able to identify it and perhaps cure folks at a certain time. So he's going to keep digging in there until he finds Des. But he sees clouds beyond clouds above me, wastes beyond wastes below, but nothing drear can move me. I will not, cannot go. He's not going to leave without his kid. He is having humans and vampires alike threatening him, those clouds above him and wastes below. So there are vampires out there jumping on the hoods of cars and threatening people, and then people with shotguns killing the vampires and then turning the guns onto other humans. There are a lot of vigilantes out there intentionally hunting down these vampires, and also the government collecting people who they believe may have been infected just to make sure. So everything is going super sideways really quickly. Claire being replaced with the general has very quickly turned this into more of a military operation. And we're going to see a lot more of those internment camps that we had discussed in a previous episode in this one. We're going to go on another break, and when we come back, we are going to catch up with Luther as he is finding Teresa, and also catch up with Rachel. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Discussing this concept of the Emily Bronte poem that is used for the title of episode 7, called "The Night is Darkening Round Me," and how this applies not just to Luther, but also to Mila and many other characters throughout this episode. Now we are going to talk about where we are finding Luther. So Luther spends a ton of this episode looking for Des, trying to catch up with him and Teresa, where he has sent them to his friend's medical practice. However, he is facing a lot of obstacles on the way, both violent vampires and humans who have not turned, whether that be yet or they just don't have that gene. But he does finally make it to the location that he had directed them to. But when he gets there, he sees that Teresa is dead, because it turns out that his friend had already turned into a vampire prior to their arrival, and he was feeding upon Teresa when Des ran on Teresa's orders. So Des is still sick and out there, and he's missing. And also, honestly, Luther doesn't have a way to tell whether Teresa was fed upon by Des or by the doctor. So that's also very grim in him possibly thinking that he could have additionally sentenced Teresa to her death by sending her with Des, even though Teresa was fully aware of the risks. She is the one who found that NH47 gene and identified it to begin with, and was able to tell that Des had it. So she knew what was up, but that might be particularly upsetting and harrowing for Luther to even have to consider the idea that his son might have turned and then killed his friend. Because Des is also missing. At the worst, he has murdered Teresa, and may feel some type of way about that, which makes me think of Marvel Zombies and how whenever Peter Parker is really feeding on humans in his zombie state, he gets really ravenous, but as soon as he is sated, then he bursts into tears about the people he has killed, especially those that may or may not be close to him. And Des being missing in this context reminds me of that comic series, which is one of my favorites for just being really interesting and fun and shaking everything up. It provides a very interesting premise that's right up there with House of M for me. So if you've not read Marvel Zombies yet, check it out. It redraws the lines between hero and villain in many ways, and new alliances must be forged. I loved it. But that's what it reminds me of in this episode. So, Des is missing. Luther doesn't know precisely what happened. Either way, he doomed Teresa to her death by sending her alone with Des. Des is either missing, and he's also sick, and or he killed Teresa, and or he may be about to turn, or could turn at any time, and he has no supervision. So, we do get to see Luther fight another vampire, and he's getting a little bit better at this. He's trying. He's a man of science, but he's doing his best to kill these vampires. And then we also see Rachel show up. I was excited to see Rachel pop up again in this episode. She's clearly not entirely stable, but she does love her son more than anything else. And that is super clear from how she interacts with Des. He is her number one priority, just as he is for Luther. Now, Rachel may come across a little bit crazed in her love for Des, maybe a little obsessive, and not entirely all there. She tries to do things like showing him a blanket that he used when he was a baby, and asks him if he remembers it, which of course he doesn't, because he hasn't seen that blanket in so many years, because he's been separated from his mother, because she wasn't safe for him to ultimately be around, for whatever reason. They are really implying that it's because of mental health issues, and that's how they're playing it, but I'm not super sure how this was ultimately that dangerous for Des. I can understand that being an environment that Luther would be cautious about putting his son in, but I'm not entirely sure, because Rachel doesn't seem to be dangerous. Prone to outbursts and emotional fits, perhaps. But dangerous necessarily? I'm not so sure about that. I may just have to see where this goes. So maybe they will do something more with Rachel as we go forward that will illuminate the reasons behind her and Luther splitting up some more, and also her forced separation from Des. That was even backed by the court. Rachel is really dedicated to Des, though, and she is trying to figure out what's wrong with him because he seems sick, and he tells her that he's cold, but then she checks his temperature and he is absolutely burning up after she puts the blanket on him. So she determines that he definitely has a fever and does what she can to make him more comfortable and help him feel better. Rachel also has to face some men from the government at the door. So Niklos and them know that he's gone right now. Niklos has set Luther loose to go and find them as well. So this isn't a secret by any means. Rachel is therefore also someone that they are keeping an eye out for, because that's his ex-wife. She has already expressed interest in seeing Des, and if he has nowhere else to go, perhaps he may turn to her. Even if he originally told them that he did not want to see his mother when we were back in episode 1 or 2, and they were holding him separate from his dad at the facility/police station. So they do send someone from the government to the front door of Rachel's home, and Rachel tries telling them, hey, my kid's not here, etc., but they go to force their way into her home. And Rachel doesn't really even blink. She fires 3 rounds into this man when he tries to force his way in. She triple taps him, and he goes down quick. And then before Des can even really fully inquire as to what's going on, she grabs him and tells him to come with her, and she covers his eyes so he doesn't have to see the body of this man she just killed, and then takes him out of the house. And she's like, "Don't look, baby, don't look." and puts him in her car, and they head out ASAP. That man is definitely dead. Rachel is justified in what she is doing as a mother. She's just trying to protect her son, and she killed the man from inside her home. He was actively still forcing his way in there when Rachel shot him. So she's been carrying around this firearm, and perhaps that could be a reason why they are very concerned about Rachel being around Des, but she's using that power and that energy that she has just to protect her son more than anything. That's her primary motivation and drive, is Des, seeing Des, protecting Des, making sure he's okay, making sure he's healthy. So Rachel really, really cares about him, and it's almost comical that she covers his eyes as she removes him from the room, because Des has seen so much messed up stuff right now, and it's not like the report of a firearm going off 3 times is really going to be confusing for this kid. Des has shown us he's very perceptive anyway, so that's very clearly a firearm being fired 3 times in rapid succession. But she tries to protect him anyway, which is kind of cute, in addition to it, just illustrating that she wants so hard to be a good mother, and her instincts are there to protect her child. Those are her primary instincts. So after Rachel goes full mama bear, or somewhere in the middle of this, actually, yeah, I think it's before this point, but slightly before, Luther calls and is like, hey, have you seen Des? I lost him. And she just gives him a really hard time and says, don't worry, if I find him, I'll take good care of him, like something you clearly can't do. So she really reams him and does not reassure him by saying, yes, I do have him. She's still resentful and bitter for all of these years that Luther has kept her from her son. And so she's kind of taking that out on him. But in the meantime, Luther doesn't entirely know where Des is, which is also horrifying. At least when Des was with Luther all the time, because Luther had custody, Rachel could know that he was reasonably safe. He was with somebody who cared about him and who had his best interests at heart and was actively taking care of him, which is very different from going, hey, I don't know where our son is, but, if I find him, I'll take care of him because you're bad at this. That's grim. But that is what is happening in this episode. While all that drama is going on, Michael is having another meeting of the Bloods and trying to really hone what and who they are as Blood Nation. In the meantime, Mila starts dating one of the cops who was investigating her when they show up to her door. And we find that Mila is attracted to women. We don't know if she's solely attracted to women, but she begins dating this female cop and doesn't feed on her or anything like that. She seems to genuinely have affection and respect and appreciation for this person. And of course, they call off the investigation once they find her where she is and being well and safe and healthy for as far as they can tell. But she is still a cop after all, Mila's girlfriend. And so Mila is also still drinking her blood bags in secret. There's not much in that fridge. I don't know why her girlfriend has not found those yet. Maybe because it was in the crisper drawer. But her girlfriend just does not seem to notice that Mila is drinking blood bags or that she doesn't seem to like any food. She notices that Mila doesn't like popcorn, but that's the only thing she inquires about. Mila's like, I just don't like popcorn. And she's like, what? I thought everybody liked popcorn. And she's like, not me. And they just call it a day. Even after her girlfriend sees Danny on screen and how upset Mila gets when Danny says that she misses her sister. So that's really upsetting for Mila, and the cop picks up that that's her sister, and it's like, oh my gosh, that's terrible. But, you know, don't feel bad because that's not you. You're not one of those things. Your sister is. And that's different, which is pretty gutting for Mila, who is still just closely and tightly holding on to this secret. Also, the vampires do have that bloodlust, that bloodthirst, and so they get their strength from it too. So Mila not drinking more blood can also make her weaker than the others, but it maintains her moral high ground that is very important to her. Phrasing it that way makes it seem like I am deriding it, but I'm not. I truly believe that Mila really is kind of the hero that we need, or the one that we deserve in this situation, in which she has a really interesting backstory, and she's ready to go out and handle them, even if she is at somewhat of a disadvantage. And she's not doing good just for the sake of doing good. She's mad. She has a backstory that goes into it and everything, which is one of the things that I live for in learning about good guys. It's way less fun if the good guys are good just because they're good. And that is what makes Mila such a compelling character for me, is that is not just her reasoning. She wants revenge on her sister and all others who are victimizing people just going about their lives. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to pick up with DNS and Niklos.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about Mila, Michael, Des, and Luther, as well as Rachel. Now we are going to talk about DNS. So we know that Niklos set Luther loose and sent someone to kill him and perhaps also retrieve the others. The others being Teresa and or Des. But turns out they're not able to kill Luther, and so Niklos is really annoyed about that. It seems that they don't want him to cure vampirism, per se. So there's another agenda that's ongoing that we're not fully informed on yet. But we have all of these anti-vampire vigilantes running around. They are killing people. They're kidnapping folks. And we also see the government doing that and putting folks into internment camps. We also see via Luther's interactions with some of the people in a community or neighborhood that folks are being killed by these vigilantes in their own homes just through association with someone who has turned into a vampire. They are pretty much doing the equivalent of contact tracing and then either killing everyone in that home that is shared with the vampiric individual, or they are rounding them up in vans and buses and taking them to an internment camp. So Luther now not only can't find his kid, but he also has to worry about his kid perhaps being in some sort of internment camp. And his kid may or may not be a vampire. There's a lot going on for poor Luther right now, especially since Rachel refused to tell him that Des was with her. She and Des are now also on the road and are staying in a motel room after that interaction in which she killed the DNS agent who showed up to the house. Now, Luther is getting pursued by more DNS agents, and one who is after him sees that Luther saw him attack a family. But Luther is saved by Jimmy, so the FBI agent who had been undercover in the motorcycle club. But Jimmy, instead of treating him as an equal or an ally in any way, just tells Luther, hey, this is where we're going, this is what we're going to do, I was sent to bring you in, and no, you can't go and look for your son. But it becomes very clear that Luther is not going to back down from that, and Luther asks Jimmy if he has any kids. And Jimmy pretty much acquiesces and is just like, alright, but we're going to go through and find him on our way out of town. So we need to find him ASAP. Let's go look for him ASAP and then get out of Dodge. And that's really only coming about because Luther understands that he is more valuable alive than dead to Jimmy. So he knows that he can't threaten Jimmy and Jimmy be worried, but he can threaten himself. And he has that stolen handgun, and he holds it to his own head. Jimmy is oddly also holding a firearm pointed at Luther, but Luther knows he's not going to shoot, at least not in a deadly way. But Luther knows that if he shoots himself, and he is coming off as being just about urgent and fearful of what's happening for his son enough to do so, that Jimmy does go ahead and back down. He's like, do you have any kids? And Jimmy's pretty much like, yeah. And he's like, okay then, let me go and find my kid. So Jimmy agrees to help him find Des before they move forward. And Des is in this motel room waiting for Rachel to get out of the shower. And he's kind of trying to alert her that there might be something weird going on because he hears a sound outside the door. But when he opens the door and checks, there's no one there. However, the room next to theirs has an adjoining door on the interior, and a vampire blows his way through the wall and then goes and chases down Des. Fortunately, or unfortunately, there is a DNS agent nearby who takes Des into custody to go to one of those vampire internment camps. So he kills the vampire and saves Des, but then won't let Des go back for his mom or anything. You would think they might also want to put Rachel in custody, but turns out, nah. And so they take just Des to this vampire internment camp, and then we see Rachel come out in her towel to see that the front door of the motel room is open and there's no sign of Des or anything out in the front. She has no idea what specifically happened. While that's happening, Jimmy and Luther show up at Rachel's house and see no one there, but they find out, there's a dead guy. They do also, though, find their way to that internment camp for vampires in their search for Des. Now, Jimmy does not want Luther to go in and save Des. He's trying to infiltrate an internment camp. And Luther's really not prepared for this type of activity. But Luther goes ahead and goes in anyway. And he thinks that maybe Des hasn't turned yet, even if he does have that NH47 predator gene. So he could be a blood already, but Luther's holding out hope that his son isn't, even if all of the science and math tells him that he very likely is. But he goes in through the fence and decides to try to save his son anyway. There is a lot going on in this episode, much like the previous episode. Although this one didn't feel as busy. I really like the flow of this one, but maybe it's just because there was so much of Mila in it. And she's one of my faves. But there are a lot of people who are just popping up briefly in this episode. So Mila has to deal with the detectives, but then she ends up getting to date one, and they seem to really care about each other. And Mila doesn't really talk about her family or anything about her that much. She's mostly just talking to this new partner who is a detective or an investigator about just mundane stuff. She just wants to remember what it's like just to be a human for a bit. And that's so sad because it doesn't take very long for the detective to end up finding out about who and what Mila truly is. Additionally, we have Danny over here trying to guide the way that Michael is leading Blood Nation. And Ava is not a fan of this. She does not like Danny at all. She seems to outright hate her and does not like any of her ideas or her interactions with Michael. And in this episode, you have Ava and Danny arguing these two different points. Almost like the angel and the demon on his shoulders. But one is a blood and one is a vertilac. They're both vampires. So Ava says that he needs to get out there so that the people of Blood Nation, the vampires of Blood Nation, can see his face and get some FaceTime with him and really understand what their movement is about to help ground them to it. But Danny argues that Michael should not be out there that much because he should keep kind of a low profile to really build into the mythos of who he is, to let them come up with their own ideas in order for him to come off as more intimidating and more important. So it's kind of coming down to brand management right now, and that's very weird as a concept for vampires, except it's in a capitalistic society just like we're in right now. And so in that manner, I'm like, yeah, okay, I can see why vampires would want to work on their brand management. This makes a lot of sense. So it fits really well in with a capitalistic society like what we have in modern day America. And he's really at war with himself to decide whose advice he wants to follow. In the meantime, we also have Kaylee going out there and trying to really make up for the death of Jurgen. So after she's told to meet Nikos there and he kills Jurgen without even saying hey or leaving a note, she is totally distraught, and then her vehicle breaks down. So then she gets chased by a blood vampire, and when she tries to save her life by explaining who she is and what she can do for Blood Nation, Ava and Brock decide to not kill her, but instead kidnap her, tie her up, and slice her neck slowly so that they can continually feed off of her as being like their juice box, because they are bloods, not vertilacs. So they can't just like keep her alive. They normally feed pretty heavily. So they are just licking the blood off of her neck, pretty much lapping at it like it is a cat lapping up cream. Of course, the visual isn't precisely the same, but it's a similar concept. It's keeping her tied up there as kind of a treat for themselves. They're supposed to only be feeding on certain individuals on sanctioned hunts and everything, and that's something that Ava lights into Brock about initially, but later on she decides that, you know what, it's really not that bad, and she's fine with stringing up Kaylee. Part of it's just because Ava is only 19, And she's also still really mad at Danny, and she's mad that Michael isn't even there right then because he's out with Danny at some club trying to turn the president's daughter, because she goes to this exclusive nightclub that Danny had gone to when she was chasing money and power instead of this hierarchy with the Bloods in her search for power. So she has taken Michael there, and they do drugs and they dance a lot, and then they have already found out that the president's daughter has that predator gene, so they know that they can expose her to it, and they do so. So because of that, there's no one around to save Kaylee for a while, and Brock and Ava feed on her for quite a bit, and by the time that Michael and Danny get back home, and Michael notices that something weird is happening, Kaylee's still okay. She's still alive. They haven't bitten her, so she hasn't really turned, although I think that being licked in an open wound might be able to do it too, considering that saliva transmission is what seems to have turned Mila to begin with, was saliva in that bite. Who knows? We're gonna see as we go along, but it looks like Kaylee, at least for now, is still human, and Michael has to crack down on Ava and Brock, which is not fun for anyone involved, and it is just further promoting that rift between Michael and Ava, and Danny seems to be eating all of it up. Overall, I really enjoyed this episode. It was nice to get to know more about Rachel, and seeing that even though she's largely been portrayed as being kind of unhinged, she really does love her son, and Des also recognizes that. And when he's in a bind and he doesn't feel he has anyone else to call, he does still end up calling Rachel. He knows that it might be chancy, but that it's better than what he's doing right then, being sick and wandering around in the elements, perhaps being about to turn. So I enjoyed this concept. I also really liked the Night is Darkening Round Me reference to the Emily Bronte poem, and thoroughly enjoyed just everything, how it played out in this episode. I did have some minor questions here and there, but overall, it really pulled through for me, and I've gotten a well-rounded examination of who Rachel is as a person. She is still unhinged enough to not be honest with Luther about the fact that their child, who is missing and very clearly ill, is at her house and safe with her, but she does still care about Des, so there's room for personal growth, is the way that I am going to be looking at that as we move forward. I'm also stoked to see Mila putting these notches on her stick for all of the people, the vampires, that she has killed so far. And when she starts doing those notches, we are up to, I want to say 6. She's making the 6th notch. I'm a little bit confused why she doesn't do like the slash marks that indicate, 5 at a time. But that is her business. That's not mine. So a lot happens in this episode, but Kaylee is now with the Bloods. We have Mila dating a cop, but still also wanting to kill these vampires. We still have Michael trying to fight for control in the leadership of this movement that he's found himself in the middle of. And we also have Des learning some life lessons while we wait to see if he turns, while Luther is hunting him down with Jimmy. That is all I have for you today, and I hope that you enjoyed this episode. If you haven't checked out V-Wars yet, first off, what are you doing? Listen to the podcast before you watch the show. But secondly, live your best life. If that's what you're into, do it. But go check it out if you've not seen it yet. It is really fun as a show, and even if you don't normally like sci-fi, or you have someone in your life who doesn't normally like sci-fi, this can be a really good stepping stone for that, as can the TV show Upload. So I would recommend both of those. Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please subscribe to the show, and writing a nice review always really helps us. Also, if you could please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, I'd appreciate it. Thank you kindly, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.